Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive into All Quiet on the Western Front. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's just jump right in. You shared this powerful book with us, and I have to admit, I'm really eager to unpack it, explore World War I, but, through the eyes of Paul Bäumer.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story.
It is. It takes us from, that naive enthusiasm of young recruits all the way to the brutal realities of trench warfare and the scars that it leaves.
Yeah, and what's really incredible is how much it still resonates with readers even today. Like Remarque's ability to capture the psychological and emotional toll of war, it's really remarkable.
Yeah, for sure. The story starts with Paul and his classmates, right? They're
Mm.
all caught up in this wave of patriotism that's sweeping Germany in 1914.
Right.
And their schoolmaster, Kemmerich, he's really pushing them to enlist. All this talk about duty and glory.
Yeah, Kemmerich is really interesting. He kind of embodies that blind enthusiasm that was so prevalent at the time, completely detached from the reality of war, just focuses on these abstract notions of heroism and sacrifice.
And Paul and his friends, they get swept up in all of it, totally unaware of what's waiting for them.
Right, and then their training is a real rude awakening. The brutal regimen under Corporal Himmelstoss, he's just this cruel and petty tyrant who seems to relish in dehumanizing them.
I mean, Himmelstoss really stands out as a symbol of the dehumanizing aspects of military training. It's almost as if the system itself is, designed to just strip away their individuality and turn them into mindless killing machines.
That's a great point. It's like Himmelstoss isn't just a sadistic individual. He represents a whole system that wants to mold these young men into soldiers who just follow orders without question.
And it's amazing how quickly their initial enthusiasm just fades away when they start facing those, harsh realities of training.
Absolutely. The physical and psychological toll is huge. They begin to question the ideals that led them to enlist in the first place.
Right. Then the story shifts to the front lines, where Paul and his comrades are just thrust into this nightmare of trench warfare.
And the descriptions of the trenches, they're so vivid, so visceral. The mud, the rats, the stench of death, that constant threat of shelling and gas attacks. It's just a truly horrific environment.
You can almost feel the claustrophobia and despair just closing in on you as you read those passages. It's no wonder that so many soldiers suffered from shell shock and all this psychological trauma.
Exactly. Remarque doesn't shy away from depicting the psychological impact of war at all. He shows how that constant threat of death, the horrific conditions, it all erodes their mental and emotional well-being.
One of the things that really struck me was how the soldiers were able to find moments of camaraderie and humor amidst all this despair. It's almost paradoxical.
It is. And it speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. Sharing stories, jokes, stolen food, finding moments of solace and connection in the face of unimaginable hardship.
But even that camaraderie comes at a cost. Paul sees his friends die one by one, and each loss takes a heavy toll. The death of Kemmerich, his classmate, is particularly poignant.
Yeah. Kemmerich's death is really a turning point for Paul. That's where he realizes the fragility of life on the front lines and just how arbitrary death is. It shakes him to his core.
It's so clear that each death kind of contributes to Paul's growing sense of disillusionment and detachment. He just becomes increasingly cynical and emotionally numb as a way to cope with this, overwhelming grief and trauma.
It's like a defense mechanism, a way to protect himself from the emotional onslaught of war, detaching from his feelings just to survive.
Then we have that chapter where Paul gets leave and goes home to visit his family.
Right.
It's such a stark contrast to the horrors of the trenches, but it's also a deeply unsettling experience for him.
He's alienated from his family and, the civilian world. They don't understand what he's been through, and he can't explain it to them.
He's caught between two worlds. Doesn't belong to either one. The war has changed him so much that he just doesn't fit into the life he once knew.
It's such a powerful exploration of that alienation that many veterans experience when they come home from war. They've seen and done things that are just unimaginable to people who haven't been there, and that creates a huge gap in understanding that's just so hard to bridge.
He's really struggling to reconcile his wartime experiences with his pre-war life. He feels like a stranger in his own home.
You can just tell he's haunted by the memories of the trenches, the deaths of his friends, that constant threat of violence. It's almost like a part of him was left behind on the battlefield.
And then that feeling of alienation is even worse when he encounters a group of Russian prisoners of war.
Yeah,
It's a pivotal moment in the novel.
absolutely. Paul sees the humanity in his supposed enemies, realizing that they're just ordinary men caught up in the same senseless conflict.
It challenges all that propaganda that dehumanizes the enemy, and it forces him to question everything he thought he knew about the war.
He starts to see the war as the senseless waste of human life, a conflict driven by these abstract ideologies that have nothing to do with the reality on the ground.
And then that realization is further reinforced when Paul is trapped in a shell hole with a French soldier and is forced to kill him in self-defense.
Right. It's a brutal encounter, so intimate, it strips away any remaining illusions about the nature of war. Paul has to confront those primal instincts that war unleashes, and the guilt and remorse that comes with taking a human life.
The scene is just so powerful and disturbing. It highlights those dehumanizing effects of war and that psychological toll it takes on the people who are fighting in it.
Yeah. Paul is deeply shaken. He's forced to confront the true cost of war, not just in terms of, physical casualties, but also the damage it does to the human soul.
It's a moment that really underscores the tragedy of war, the way it forces people to commit acts that just violate their own moral compass.
And it leaves Paul with this profound sense of guilt, a much deeper understanding of that shared humanity that connects him to his supposed enemies. I mean, that experience in the shell hole, it really stays with Paul. It's a turning point for him. He sees the war differently, and the effects, they just kind of linger.
Right, it's like that encounter just stripped away the last little bit of his innocence, left him with this stark awareness of how brutal war really is.
Yeah, exactly. And that awareness, it becomes even more pronounced, as Paul and his comrades face more horrors, like that scene where they have to clear out a village and they find a cat giving birth in a cellar.
Oh man, that scene, that one always got to me. It's such a stark contrast. Like you have the beauty of new life, but right in the middle of all this destruction and death.
It's like it highlights how absurd war is, how life and death can be so close together. And you see the soldiers struggling to hold on to any bit of their own humanity in the middle of all that chaos.
And then there's that episode with the young recruit, right? The one who's terrified during a bombardment. Paul tries to comfort him. It shows how, even with their own trauma, the veterans, they try to protect the new recruits.
Yeah, there's this sense of responsibility there, passing the torch, even though they know it's a burden that no one should have to carry.
It's like they're trying to protect that innocence that they've already lost.
Exactly. They've seen too much, experienced too much, and they don't want these young recruits to end up jaded and disillusioned like them.
But even with their efforts, people keep dying. Paul loses more of his friends. And the emotional toll, it just keeps getting heavier.
Yeah, the deaths of Deterring and Cat, those are especially devastating. Deterring, he just gets so desperate, he tries to desert, but they catch him. And then Cat, he's like a mentor to Paul, almost a father figure. He gets killed by shrapnel right as Paul is carrying him to safety.
Man, Cat's death, that's a crushing blow. It leaves Paul feeling completely alone, like everything's been stripped away from him.
It's like a symbol of the complete loss of innocence, the erosion of everything that gave him strengths, everything that gave him purpose.
And yet there's this strange sense of detachment in how Paul describes it all. It's like he's numb. He can't really process the grief and the trauma.
That's a classic sign of trauma, that emotional detachment, a way to survive, a way to cope with being overwhelmed by emotions.
It's just heartbreaking to see how the war has taken away his ability to feel, to connect with other people.
He's a shell of who he used to be, just hollowed out by the violence and loss.
And then as the war is coming to an end, there's this little bit of hope. The Kaiser visits the front lines.
It's exciting for a moment. It reminds them that there's a world outside of the trenches, the soldiers are energized, and there's this feeling of anticipation.
But it doesn't last. The Kaiser's visit is just for show, and they're sent right back to the front lines.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how disconnected the politicians are from what's really happening in the war.
And it just adds to the soldiers' disillusionment. They realize they're just pawns in a game that's being played by people in power.
Expendable. Their lives are sacrificed for a cause they don't even believe in anymore.
As the war keeps dragging on, Paul's disillusionment gets even deeper. He sees all this pointless death on both sides, and he realizes that the enemy, they're not some monster. They're ordinary men who are caught up in the same nightmare.
That's a crucial turning point for Paul. It makes the enemy human and forces him to face how pointless the whole conflict is.
Right, like that encounter in the shell hole that already planted the seeds, but now, seeing it firsthand on the front lines, it solidifies it for him.
He sees the fear in their eyes, the pain, the longing for home. He recognizes himself in them.
It's that shared humanity, the kind that goes beyond countries and politics.
Exactly. And it makes him even more despairing because he realizes the war is just this pointless tragedy where brother is fighting brother for no good reason.
It's like the scales have fallen from his eyes. He sees the war for what it really is, a monster that devours lives and leaves nothing but destruction.
And you see that disillusionment reflected in how the soldiers themselves are falling apart. They're exhausted, wounded, haunted by everything they've seen.
They're just shadows of who they used to be. All that youthful energy and idealism is gone, replaced by cynicism and despair.
The war has just crushed them, left them scarred physically and emotionally.
That scene where Paul and his friend Krop get wounded and sent to the hospital, it's so sad.
It shows just how vulnerable they are, their bodies broken by the violence.
And it shows how bad the medical care is. They're treated like animals, just herded through the system. No one cares about their individual needs or suffering.
Krop having his leg amputated, that's brutal. It's a physical reminder of how the war will affect them forever. How it can take away your limbs, your way of life, your future.
And it's not just the physical wounds. After the amputation, Krop just falls apart mentally and emotionally. He's withdrawn, depressed, filled with despair.
It's a reminder that the war keeps hurting people even after the fighting stops. The trauma is like a wound that never heals.
And you see Paul, even though he seems to be coping better, he's deeply affected by Krop's pain.
He sees it as a reflection of his own pain, a reminder that life is fragile, that death is always close.
Their shared experience in the hospital brings them closer, but it also shows how lost and isolated they both feel.
They're just two young men who have had their youth stolen, their innocence destroyed, trying to make sense of a world that's been shattered.
And when Paul goes back to the front lines after recovering, it's clear the war is in its final, brutal stage.
The fighting is worse than ever. Death is everywhere. Paul's few remaining friends die one by one, and he's more and more isolated and despairing.
He's like a ghost among ghosts, wandering through all this death and destruction.
He's lost everyone and everything he cared about. The war has just hollowed him out completely. He's empty and lost.
Yeah, it's like he's surrounded by all this death. But then there are these little moments of peace. Like when Paul's swimming in the river, behind the lines, he feels this sense of calm for a second.
It's powerful how, even in war, you have these little glimpses of beauty, this sense of serenity that's just the opposite of all the brutality around them.
Yeah, and it makes you realize just how tragic it is. Like, the war has taken away his ability to appreciate these moments. He knows it won't last, that he'll be back in the fighting soon.
As the war is ending, you see this apathy growing among the soldiers, this sense of, like, whatever happens, happens. They're resigned to their fate, like death is just inevitable. It's like they've lost their purpose. They don't believe in what they're fighting for anymore. All they have left is this acceptance that they're going to die.
And then the irony of it all, Paul is killed on a quiet day.
Yeah, he lives through years of fighting, and then he dies when there's actually a chance for peace.
And that last line of the book, all quiet on the Western Front, it takes on this whole new meaning after Paul's death.
It's like it shows how pointless his death was. All those lives lost in a war that accomplished nothing.
And the silence, it's not just on the battlefield. It's like the silence of death.
Yeah.
Of a whole generation that's gone.
And it makes you think about the cost of war, how fragile peace really is.
All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a powerful book. A reminder of the human cost of war. And a warning against repeating the mistakes of the past.
It's a book that everyone should read, definitely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been great exploring this book with you.